as you see, I will be trying to talk about Maghrebi foreign policy is somehow difficult. It's not as difficult as, or maybe just as difficult as to try to talk about European foreign policy, because there is, from what I understand, not a real European foreign policy. There are the foreign policies of the member states, and in the case of the Maghreb, it's even less the case of an existing Maghrebi foreign policy. There is no such a thing as a Maghrebi foreign policy, but there are as many foreign policies as there are states. And although foreign policy, and we have to keep in mind here that foreign policy is a very state-centered political activity, which means that if we want to go to a level lower than the state and talk about different ethnic groups, for instance, we will not be talking about Berber foreign policy, we will not be talking about Sahrawi foreign policy, we will not be talking, but we can be talking about international activities of different non-state actors. So when I will be speaking here, this is my caveat, my introductory caveat, to tell you that when I will be talking here about Maghrebi foreign policies, I will be essentially speaking about the foreign policies of the three central European Maghrebi states, meaning Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. I will not be talking about Libya, I will not be talking about Mauritania. So this is the plan I will be adopting here today. I am also, my second caveat is that I am a theory person. I feel and I believe that concepts are very important for us to make sense of the reality around us. So this is why you, in this presentation here, in this summary of my presentation, you hardly find the word Maghreb or foreign policy. You find the concepts that will organize or frame my discussion here with you. So I will speak about some things that make each one of these three countries very specific. A time-centered specificity, a space-centered specificity, a people-centered specificity. And then I will talk about this, this relationship, the inter-Maghrebi relationship that varies from rivalry to cooperation from time to time, and most of the time, as I would say here, what we have is a go-it-alone foreign policy by each one of the three Maghrebi states. So after making all these presentations, then I will deal with the impact of on these foreign of these different concepts on the three foreign policies. So I will make my presentation and then we can open for a talk. But if there is a need to, if you want to stop me at a certain moment and ask me a specific question or to clarify something specific, you can please feel free to in doing so. Okay. So, as I was saying right at the beginning, there is no foreign policy, or there is no Maghrebi foreign policy, but there are the foreign policies of Algeria, of Morocco, and of Tunisia. The Maghreb Arab Union does not have a Mr. or Mrs. foreign policy, and these states have not reached any level of intense cooperation so that they can speak with one single voice. They are members of several common organizations. They share several similarities, but that's not what makes of them. That doesn't elevate their level of practice of foreign policy to allow us to speak about a Maghrebi foreign policy. So there is no such a thing as a Maghrebi foreign policy. But there are Maghrebi foreign policies, and this is what I will be discussing here today. This can come as a surprise since these states are said to share many things. These states share a common language, supposedly a common religion, supposedly a similar ethnic divide. All of them have a minor Berber minority, although the Berber minority in Morocco is far bigger than the Berber minority in Tunisia. All of them went through French colonization, although Morocco had a dual colonization, French and Spanish colonization, and Morocco and Tunisia were under a protectorate, whereas Algeria was a French colony. French territory, and they share also a very young population. It's a very young population. When all these countries reached their independence over 60 or almost 60 years ago, all of them had huge, very similar challenges. All of them had the challenge to deal with young populations with very high level of illiteracy, with very low infrastructure. So they were supposed to share many things. So all these things these states shared might or should, some say should have led them to follow rather a collaborative or cooperative foreign policies. As a matter of fact, that's not what has happened since the independence of these three Maghrebi states. And as I was saying, there are many also differences. Even in these similarities I refer to here, there are many differences among these three Maghrebi states. Besides the dual protectorate, the impact of the Berber population, the Berber minority in Morocco and in Tunisia is completely different. How and the way the Algerian state has dealt with the Berber minority and the way the Moroccan state has dealt with the Berber minority is also different. So there are differences that even within these similarities, and one could not, cannot, should not undermine the importance of oil in Algeria and in Algeria's foreign policy. So all of these slight differences in what apparently sounds as similarities should bring us to understand the differences among the foreign policies and the rivalry among these three states in their foreign policies. So what I will do from now is that I will go to the time-centered specificity of the three countries, and then I'll go through the space-centered specificity of all three states, and then the people-centered specificity of all three states. So this is how I will go over these things. The time-centered specificity. Maybe I should explain what I mean by time-centered specificity. I think that we cannot, foreign policy is not something static. It's not a given that exists. The national interest is not something that exists and that is a given and that states have to defend. The national interest is something socially constructed, and it is in continuous change. It develops, it evolves with time and with space. So I don't think that geopolitics is a very useful concept, but I think that space is very important to explain and many of the external actions of states. And the importance of space is not also a given. We can work with space. We can manipulate space. We can bypass the limitations that space is imposing on us, or we just feel totally overwhelmed with the limitations that space imposes on us. So space is important, time is important, but I want to insist here that all these three components, both these two components, time and space, should not be dealt with as givens and as things that we just have to accept. And this is why I added the third component, the people-centered specificity, because I think that these two other concepts, the time and space, are socially constructed, and we have to deal them as evolving concepts and evolving limitations / opportunities. So this is how I use these, why I brought these three concepts, time, space, and people. So let's go for the time-centered specificity of Algeria. I think that in the case of Algeria, there is one element that needs to be taken into consideration. There are several elements that I bring here, but that need to be taken into consideration when one speaks about Algeria's foreign policy. And the first one I would like to underline is the impact of the Ottoman Empire. Algeria was part of the Ottoman Empire for a long period of time. Algeria did not exist as a state before it was colonized by France, and this has consequences for today's Algeria. It didn't have consequences under the Ottoman Empire, but it has consequences for today's Algeria. The fact that Algeria has to prove that it exists and that it has to be taken seriously, that it has a role to play, regardless of the fact that it did not exist before, because many states, by the way, did not exist 200 years ago, and today they are mega superpowers. So it's not because it didn't exist that it should not be taken into consideration. And this is very important in the case of Algeria because it deals with two neighbors, Tunisia and Morocco, that have historical depth that create this necessity for Algeria to justify itself and prove its relevance today in regional politics and in world politics. So this is why this is the relevance of the fact that Algeria was part of the Ottoman Empire. And we have and after the Ottoman Empire, Algeria was colonized by the French, and it was colonized by the French for over 130 years. So many generations of French people were born in Algeria, raised in Algeria, felt like Algerians, acted like Algerians, and this ended up having a major impact on the identity of these French people and on the social structure of Algerian society and how Algeria deals with its colonial past. And up until very recently, French-Algerian relations were always handling the impact of the history of colonization. France and Algeria supposedly have turned the page now and supposedly have solved the problem, the issues that resulted from colonization and decolonization, but they have had a major impact in French-Algerian relations, and this has resulted in this has had a serious impact on Algeria's foreign policy. The third element I want to call your attention to here is the long struggle against French colonization and the costs of that for Algeria. In Algeria's historiography, 1 million Algerians died during the decolonization war, and this constructs a national identity. This creates a logic for a revolutionary state that resulted from the decolonization process. So this long struggle, extremely violent struggle against French colonization, also has had its impact on Algeria's foreign policy after it became independent. In the fact in particular that Algeria did not reach its independence through a negotiated process. Algeria reached its independence after a long bloody war that took it to adopt a different persona as an independent state. So all of these elements make that there is a belief in Algeria that this is Algeria's moment in history. Algeria is maybe 1,000 years ago it was Tunisia's moment, maybe 200 years or 300 years ago it was Morocco's moment, maybe 200 or 300 years ago it was Turkey's moment, but today this is Algeria's moment. And Algeria, so when there is a discussion, and I will go back to this in my discussion, when we talk about Algeria as the pivot of the region, this resonates very positively in Algeria because Algerians see themselves as a key player, as the pivot, not only a key player, as the pivot of the region. This is Algeria's moment in history. So it's a consequence of all these developments that brought Algeria to this self-identification as the moment, this is our moment in history. As for Morocco, in the case of Morocco, the game is slightly different. Morocco is proud of its long independent history. Of course, there are as many links between the Idrisid dynasty back 1,200 years ago and whatever you can see in Europe 1,200 years ago and the current European states. So, but just like European states build their legitimacy in history, 100 years in history, and the French see the struggle against the Roman Empire as a constitutive moment of their national identity, Morocco sees Morocco's official historiography stresses on a continuity of an existing state since the 8th century. And this is very important. So Morocco is proud of this continuity. It is certainly an imagined continuity because there is no relationship between what existed in the 8th century and today's Morocco. But there is, in Morocco's official historiography, the Royal Institute for History in Morocco just produced the official historiography of Morocco that was written by historians independent from the regime. So I'm not speaking here about the official history. It's the history that was written by independent Morocco. And when you see it, there is this continuity of the existence of something similar to what we know today as Morocco. So there is this pride in Morocco, and it is, you feel it and you see it when you deal with it. For instance, as soon as you sit and talk to Moroccans, if you don't know anything about Morocco, in the 5 first minutes Moroccans are talking to you, they will be telling you that Morocco was never part of the Ottoman Empire. They will tell you very quickly that Morocco was the first state to recognize the independence of the United States. I'm sick and tired of hearing that the United States owes a lot to Morocco because Morocco was the first state to recognize its independence, but it comes immediately. In the first 5 minutes, Moroccans tell you, well, when the United States were struggling for its independence and became independent, we were an independent state and we recognized the independence of that state. And the Treaty of Friendship between Morocco and the United States is said to be the longest existing treaty in contemporary international relations. So there is this pride of having this historical depth. And I want to insist on this because we need to link this to the Algerian case of non-existent historical depth, but the fact that Algeria claims for its historical moment that is now. So this explains somehow the historical depth of the rivalry between Morocco and Algeria. And a third important element in the time-centered specificity of Morocco, I would claim, is the dual and short protectorate of Morocco, Spain and France. Spain in northern Morocco, France in the central part of Morocco. And this dual protectorate has had its impact in today's foreign policy. For if France was the most important trade partner of Morocco for almost 50 years, Spain today is Morocco's main trade partner. Spanish companies invest a lot in Morocco, trade a lot with Morocco, so there are very important links between economic and political links between the two former colonial powers and independent Morocco. But it goes even beyond that, because when it's this in Moroccan historiography and this history of pride, Moroccans tell you, well, it's not one European power, one European power that managed to colonize us. There had to be two European powers in order to manage to colonize us. So it's all of this. This is to tell you this dual historical, this dual view on the impact of history on the contemporary policies of the two states. Well, and if Morocco claims something of 1,200 years of history, Tunisia goes to the Carthaginian civilization. Fez wouldn't be the old city of Fez wouldn't be the old city of Fez if it was not for the Carthaginians, and if it was not for Akhawayin, and if it were not for the impact, the civilizing impact that came to Morocco from the Middle East through Tunisia. So Tunisia has, if Morocco claims 1,200 years, Tunisia claims 2,000 years, and or 3,000 years, actually. I should correct myself. So Tunisians have this is clear also in Tunisia's self-identity. When you visit Tunisia, visiting the historical sites is very important, because for the Tunisians, this is what explains their identity and what explains their difference in this very hectic region. This is the importance of the historical depth. And as opposed to Algeria, the Bey in Tunisia, just like in Egypt, had a very high level of autonomy. And so the Ottoman Empire, the relationship of Tunisia with the Ottoman Empire was a very autonomous one, and the Bey was playing a far more important, a very important role, which, although Tunisia was not an independent state, when Tunisia was under French colonization, the Bey was one of the leaders of the struggle against French colonization, because to him he was claiming his own right, his dynastic right for independence. So this is, of course, and I'm not sure I will have time to go back to this. Of course, he was defeated at the end of the day by Bourguiba. The Bey was defeated by Bourguiba, and due to, in a major part, due to his wrong alliances during the Second World War and his support of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, whereas Bourguiba was against Nazi Germany and supported the Allied, and then that gave him credibility to become the leader of Tunisia, to become the leader of the independence movement and to lead Tunisia right after independence. But this is all to stress to you the importance of this understanding of Tunisia, the pride in Tunisia of being this very small state, but this state that played a major role in the history of the region and that has had a major impact in the history of the region, as opposed to its other less important neighbors in the region. So although Tunisia is very small, it is very proud of its impact all over history on the whole region, an impact that its big neighbors have never had, according to the Tunisian understanding of its role in the region. The space-centered specificity of Algeria. Algeria, because of its bloody struggle for independence, Algeria, as soon as it became independent, started playing a very important role in very different forums around the world. In the Arab League, but essentially in the non-aligned movement, in the Organization of African Unity that was substituted subsequently by the African Union. And in order to look for Algeria, it was easy to look for Algeria on the international alliances because Algeria was consistently aligned with emancipatory movements, with movements that were struggling against colonization against the West. So Algeria, for instance, was part of the front that rejected any kind of agreement, any kind of recognition of Israel by the Arab League and by Arab states. Algeria rejects any compromises made with Israel. Algeria believes and Algeria aligns itself with the more radical states in the Arab League in rejecting any deals with Israel, for instance. So Algeria is seen in many African states, by many African states, as a friendly state, a wealthy state that has supported independence movement, that has supported the struggle of independence movements against the colonizers, that has sided consistently with those who felt some kind of injustice or unfairness. So Algeria chose to play this role, opted to play this role as a consequence of its own struggle against French colonization. And Algeria had the means to do that. It had the financial means to do that because its territory is very rich in oil and gas. So this geographical aspect of Algeria has also very major consequences on how Algeria played its role. So when it pledged support to independence movement, it was not only oral support, it was oral and financial support. For instance, even Latin American leaders who, after the fall of democracies and the coming of the military dictatorships in Latin America, several left-wing leaders from Latin America sought refuge in Algeria and lived in Algeria for a long time. I can remember here Miguel Arraes from Brazil, for instance, who lived in Algeria for a long time. And because Algeria was offering this refuge not only to Arabs, not only to Africans, but to all those who felt unsafe or ill-treated by standing regimes. And it was able to do this because it had the oil and gas that we know of. And all of this has entitled Algeria, as I was saying a few minutes ago, to be considered by several international observers, but also by itself as the pivot of North Africa, as I was going to say the kingmaker. It's not the kingmaker because that would be very paradoxical for Algeria. But as the main player in North Africa, the most influential player that has to be respected, which voice needs to be heard, and which influence has to be counted with. So this is what Algeria has claimed for itself since independence. In the case of Morocco, things, again, are slightly different. Morocco didn't get its independence after a long independence war. Morocco got its independence after a negotiated process with both Spain and France. So this has an impact on the relationship that Morocco kept with its former colonial powers. And I think that's a very interesting way of dealing with Morocco is to remind us of this image of the tree that Hassan II made some 20 years ago, over 20 years. It was closer to 30 years ago. Hassan II used the image of the tree to say that Morocco is this tree which roots are deep in Africa, which leaves breathe European air, but which is solidly anchored in the Arab world. And he explained with this image of the tree this complexity of Morocco's identity that has an African component, an Arab component, and strong Western and European tendencies. The European side in Morocco is, right after the Reconquista in 1492, hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled, and Jews fled in a great deal to Morocco. And there is these big families who have names very similar to names you would find in Andalusia. And this is what brings this complexity of Morocco in the eyes of Hassan II. So this is how Morocco is presented to itself and to the external world. The second element I would like to stress on when speaking about Morocco is something we hear constantly when we are talking to Moroccan foreign policy makers. Well, we do not choose our neighbors. We have Algeria and Spain as neighbors, and we're stuck with Algeria and Spain as neighbors, and we cannot do without them. So we have to deal with them. Had we had the choice, maybe we would have chosen something other neighbors. But we have Algeria and we have Spain, and we have to deal with these neighbors. So this is a very important spatial constraint that Morocco sees that it has to deal with. So and I insist here on the fact that this is a constraint but not a major limitation, because, for instance, in the mid-1960s, Morocco had very bad relations with Spain, very bad relations with Algeria after the Sand War of 1963, and did not recognize Mauritania. And in 1972, Morocco had allied itself with Algeria and Mauritania against Spain in order to claim the Western Sahara. The alliance with Algeria to claim the Western Sahara was very short-lived, but it was a very interesting moment in how Hassan II managed in a few years to deal with this spatial limitation of this bad neighborhood, and there was an informal alliance between Spain, Algeria, and Mauritania in the 1960s that was completely reversed in the early 1970s by Hassan II when he signed the Treaty of Friendship and established the borders with Algeria, borders that are still not ratified by the Moroccan parliament, by the way. But he signed the Treaty of Friendship that established the borders between Algeria and Morocco. And since then, and Boumediene, in that treaty and in his speech on that treaty, President Boumediene of Algeria recognized Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara and recognized Mauritania as an independent state, which Morocco was refusing to do up until then, but recognized Mauritania as an independent state, established formal diplomatic links with Mauritania, and brought both Algeria and Mauritania as allies to its claim on the Western Sahara. So we don't choose the neighbors. That's why I put this like this. I mean, we don't choose the neighbors, but we have to deal with them anyway. So today, Morocco is far closer to Spain than it is closer than to Algeria or to Mauritania. So today, the allies of Morocco are not its African Arab or Arab neighbors. It's the European neighbors. And this is so we don't choose our neighbors, but we have to deal with them anyway, and we have to work with them anyway. The third element I would like to stress on is Morocco's, what I call here Morocco's territory awareness between the past and the present. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm not sure you've heard, most of you heard of a guy called Allal al-Fassi. He was one of the big leaders of the independence movement in Morocco, and he has a map, his map for Morocco. And his map for Morocco goes until until Senegal, as far south as Senegal, and a good part of the Algerian territory is part of that map. So Morocco, when Morocco got back its independence in 1956, many leaders were saying in Morocco, this is just a first step, and we need to keep going because we need to recover all these lost territories. This is what explained the Sands War in 1963. This is what explains why Morocco did not recognize Mauritania's independence. And this is what explains the Western Sahara issue. So, and if we want to understand the Western Sahara issue, we need to put it within this context. Morocco, most Moroccan leaders today would gladly admit that Morocco has absolutely no claim on the Eastern Sahara, on the part that is under Algeria's authority today. And Morocco has no claim on Mauritania. Mauritania is an independent state today. So what remains from that map? The Western Sahara. The Western Sahara is the only thing, the only territory that remains that Morocco can claim from its glorious past. And this is why Morocco clings to the Western Sahara. So that space, so this is what explains many things in Morocco's, from a spatial point of view, this is what explains many things in Morocco's action today in terms of foreign policy. As for Tunisia, well, Tunisia is squeezed between two huge neighbors, Algeria and Libya. And when one looks at the map today, many of the turbulences and the instability from a security point of view that has affected Tunisia comes from the instability that is taking place in Libya. So these two huge neighbors, since independence, have had a major impact on Tunisia's foreign policy. They have threatened it sometimes. They have tried to establish alliances with it in other times. And Tunisia is always trying to balance its regional politics between these two huge neighbors. These two neighbors don't have claims on Tunisia. Neither Algeria nor Libya wants a part of the Tunisian territory or wants to invade Tunisia or claims that Tunisia is part of it. But both of them have had the ambition during history of influencing Tunisia and its foreign policy, and this is a given that Tunisian decision makers cannot look away from, and this is why Tunisia's closeness from Europe is sometimes can be seen as a handicap, but it was used by Tunisians many times as an asset. So Tunisia was playing consistently the triangle, Europe and the two big neighbors. So to keep its autonomy, and not autonomy, but to keep its independence and to keep its options open, Tunisia all the time looked at Europe and its European partners in order to support it in its resistance to the attempts of influence by Algeria and by Libya. So the fact that it's a small territory is an asset, but it's also is a handicap, but it's also an asset because Tunisia has managed most of the time to control its territory because precisely it is small. So when we have an attack in Gafsa in 1982, Bourguiba knows exactly who did it. When Libya's Gaddafi also threatened Tunisia, Bourguiba knew exactly who did it because this is a very small territory. So Tunisia has always, because of its geographical situation, Tunisia has all the time to control, to watch out for its neighbors and for the neighborhood in which it is geographically situated. And this takes me to the importance of the agent, the importance of people. In the case of Algeria, how am I doing in terms of time?
15 minutes.
I still have 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I have to go a little bit faster. Okay, so in terms of Algeria, we cannot also understand Algeria without taking into consideration the importance of the one-party system and the role of the FLN in struggling against independence, and the long legitimacy held by the army that was undermined only in 1988. Only in 1988 when the army attacked the Algerian people or the demonstrators in Bab el-Oued in the demonstrations of Bab el-Oued in October 1988. So up until then, the Algerian army was highly respected by the Algerian people because it was considered as the one that made most of the sacrifices that brought independence to Algeria. And the FLN, the one-party system, controlled the Algerian society in a way that this is why in Algeria, when you meet Algerians, very quickly, if we in Morocco speak about the Maghzen, in Algeria they speak about le pouvoir. Le pouvoir is this entity, the system. When we talk about computers, the system didn't let me do this or didn't let me do that. In Algeria, it's le pouvoir, the power. So the power holders it's an ambiguous entity, not very clearly defined, but there are people who have, and it's an institution. It's an institution that has perpetuated itself in power, and if today Algeria is suffering with a morbid president, it's because this system, le pouvoir, has not chosen a successor to Bouteflika. They have not reached a consensus on who should be the successor of Bouteflika. And as long as none of the players in this ambiguous entity called le pouvoir in Algeria has not chosen has not won over the other stakeholders and imposed the candidate, but they will hope that Bouteflika will still remain as the president of Algeria until one of the parties wins the debate, the internal debate within this very small, select group of people that is made essentially of the security services, the army, and the power holder within the FLN. So today people speak about the brother of President Bouteflika, but because he is part of this game. It's not because he is the brother of Bouteflika, but because he plays a role in this entity called Le Pouvoir in Algeria. And if in Algeria they have Le Pouvoir, in Morocco we have the Maghzen. I will not have time to go specifically about what the role the Maghzen plays, but it's an institution that surrounds the royal palace, the royal family, and that has provided stability and continuity to the ruling system in Morocco, and which has allowed Morocco to go through 44 years of protectorate and remain with the same dynasty ruling Morocco. I think, maybe I will not discuss the difference between Mohammed I and Hassan II, but one important thing I need to mention here in the importance of people is that the Moroccan political game cannot be understood if one does not take into consideration the domestic political game that exists within, that has existed for a long time within Morocco. Right after independence, the nationalist the nationalist leaders were very strong and were contesting the monarchy in its role. They were contesting the monarchy not in its legitimacy as the ruler, as the monarchy in Morocco, but as an absolute monarchy. The political players, the nationalist movement in Morocco, this group of politicians was contesting the absolute rule of the monarchy in Morocco and tried to establish what should have, in their eyes, looked like closer to a constitutional monarchy than what we currently have in Morocco. So this contestation ended up being completely won by the regime and by Hassan II. So by the late 1990s, all the political parties had accepted the monarchy and had accepted the central and key role of the monarchy in the Moroccan political system. But from my point of view, one cannot understand why Hassan II started defending the Western Sahara as part of Morocco if one does not understand the role played by this domestic political game in Morocco and how the two main opposition parties in the 1970s, the Socialist Party and the Istiqlal Party, dealt with that issue. In Tunisia, I would like to stress then on one major point on this slide. Two maybe, because we need to talk about post-revolutionary Tunisia. But Tunisia before the revolution had two presidents, Bourguiba and Ben Ali. If one had to summarize Bourguiba, one would recall all the reforms he did, the family code reform. Tunisia is in the Arab world a very isolated case of extended rights for women in society, a focus on education which many observers say explains the birth of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. But Bourguiba had essentially Western tendencies. You remember looking towards Europe that I was mentioning in order to balance between Tunisia, Algeria and Libya, well, Bourguiba was behind that. Bourguiba had felt closer to Europe than to any Arab roots and African roots, but essentially to Arab roots. So Bourguiba would make a point in saying, well, it's okay not to fast during the holy month of Ramadan, and he would go to a cafe in the main street of Tunisia and have a coffee during the month of Ramadan, just to stress that it is okay not to be Muslim in this country. We respect freedom of faith. Ben Ali stressed the other side of Tunisia's identity. It's the Arab identity. Under Ben Ali, well, we had the Arab League was already established in Tunisia, already under Bourguiba, but Ben Ali enjoyed having the Arab League there, enjoyed having the PLO there, and he stressed on this Arab identity of Tunisia. One way to explain this is also the growth of a Nahda under Ben Ali and the fact that Ben Ali could not afford doing the same things Bourguiba was doing, so he could not let a Nahda occupy the religious field, so Ben Ali had to play the good Arab and the good Muslim. But he stressed, so if under Bourguiba Tunisia had a stress on its Western closeness to the West, under Ben Ali it was more this Arab identity. And guess where Ben Ali was exiled after he fell from power? He went to Saudi Arabia. The second thing is, element here, is this post-revolutionary Tunisia. And to say that Tunisia, maybe I will leave this to when I will be talking about Tunisia specifically in foreign policy today. So, rivalry. Between cooperation and rivalry, there is definitely rivalry between among the Maghrebi states. There is rivalry between Algeria and Morocco. Both of them struggle for hegemony. One guy called Mohammed bin Hassan al-Alawi, guess who he is? Mohammed bin Hassan al-Alawi is the current Mohammed VI. When he was a PhD candidate, he defended a PhD thesis in which he literally wrote, in order to understand the Western Sahara issue, one should understand that this is a struggle for hegemony between Morocco and Algeria. This is the Crown Prince, but who was a PhD student, but this is the Crown Prince who is writing this 20 years ago. 20 years ago, exactly. So there is a struggle for hegemony between Morocco and Algeria. There is this power balance I mentioned between Algeria and Tunisia, and I call it don't even think about it, because the Tunisians don't accept Algeria giving them lessons. Tunisians don't accept Algeria threatening them. So they accept making alliances, and Tunisia had very close links under Bourguiba and under Ben Ali, occasionally with Algeria. But a relationship of the patron of Tunisia, Algeria as the patron of Tunisia, Tunisia never accepted that. And between Morocco and Tunisia, I use here the French expression, this French expression, just to stress that although they share many similarities, both of them go to negotiate with the European Union independently. Both of them go to negotiate with France, with Spain, with the United States autonomously, and they compete with each other instead of cooperating with each other and supporting each other. But there is cooperation among them. There is this romantic idea that there is something called the Maghreb, and this came from the struggle against the colonial powers during the 20th century, the colonial power during the 20th century. When Algeria was still under French colonization, there was the Tangier Conference in 1958, in which the three main parties, the FLN, the Neo-Dustur, and the Istiqlal Party met in Tangier and committed to build a union of Maghrebi states, first to support Algeria's struggle for independence, and then to build a union of Maghrebi states that would exist right after Algeria's independence. And this project, somehow, some reminiscence of this project came to light in 1988, in February 1989, sorry, there was a mistake there, when the Treaty of the Maghreb Arab Union was signed in Marrakesh. But this Maghreb Arab Union exists, it has offices, it has a Secretary General, the parliamentarians from the Maghreb Arab Union meet from time to time. There are some discussions that are under the Maghreb Arab Union, but it has never increased trade, it has never allowed to solve political issues, it has never managed to have a real impact on the life of people. But there is this romantic ideal of, well, one day we will build this Maghreb, and it has to be of the three of us and maybe of the five of us, including Libya and Mauritania. So most of the time, as I said, it's the go it alone strategy that ends up being the most adopted one. Algeria has lots of oil, lots of gas, and it feels that it has the ability to strike great deals because of that. Morocco does the same thing. Morocco negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Union, with the United States, Tunisia with the European Union. And these states negotiate these deals thinking that they are outsmarting the others. I think that I'm convinced that this is a political mistake, that negotiating collectively, they might reach better deals. But this is not the dominating strategy for them. So the impact on Algerian foreign policy. I think that Algeria sees itself as this pivot of the region, key player that needs to be heard and that needs to be consulted. In the Sahel, for instance, Algeria, for years and years, insistently rejected any interference of European powers or of the United States until French intervention in Mali a couple of years ago. But until the French intervention in Mali a couple of years ago in Mali, Algeria was consistently rejecting any interference of external powers and saying Saheli problems have to be solved by Saheli member states. And we are able to solve our problems. We are able to cooperate among ourselves and to solve our problems. And this is the attitude of Algeria in international politics. So it's not saying no to Israel just for the sake of saying no to Israel. It's that there is an issue behind this, an injustice behind this that Algeria sees. And when Algeria rejects dealing with Israel, it rejects dealing with what it sees as a colonial power that denies the Palestinian people from their right, that occupies illegally the land of the Palestinian people. That's why it rejects Israel. So, and the same way it rejects Israel, it rejected the apartheid regime in South Africa, and it sided with all the independence movements. So Algeria there are four major players today in the African Union. These are South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Algeria. One cannot consider Algeria as a minor player in the African Union. Algeria is one of the kingmakers, I have to say it, one of the key players in the African Union. Algeria and Europe, well, again, gas. Algeria feels that it has a very strong hand when it deals with Europe, because it has gas and it can export its gas and oil to Europe, and it can do it in order to help Europeans. So there is there is an understanding in Algeria that Algeria can be, the Algerian support is needed and not the other way around, that we need Europe, like the Tunisians, in the case of the Tunisians. In the case of the Tunisians, we need Europe. In the case of Algeria, no, it's Europe that needs our gas, and we can negotiate with the Europeans on very equal footing. As for the relationship with the US, then I think there is Algeria. It's where we see many contradictions in this Algeria posturing as a major third world leaders and major leaders of that defends those who feel injustice and stuff, but then it has a it wants to have close relationships with the United States. Bouteflika was among the first leaders in the world to condemn the 9/11 attacks. And in September, the 9/11 attack took place in September. In November, Bouteflika was already in the White House. So this is to say that Algeria, as much as it is somehow obnoxious with Europe, it wants to be close to the United States. It defends, it wants to have a close relationship with the United States. It wants to be seen as the interlocutor of the major power in the region. So if you want to talk about the Maghreb, come to talk to us. This is the posture Algeria has, and it has adopted over the last couple of decades, I would say. In the case of Morocco, I think that if the same way I talked in Tunisia, I made a comparison between Ben Ali and Bourguiba here. If under Hassan II, it was Morocco's Arab identity that was stressed all the time. Hassan II hosted many Arab League summits. The 1974 summit that recognized the PLO as the only legitimate representative of the Palestinian people was held in Rabat. The first time the Arab League put together a peace plan for the Middle East in 1982, it was in Fas. So Hassan II was the chair of the Al-Quds Committee in the Organization of Islamic State. Hassan II played an important role in the mediation between Israelis and Palestinians. And when Hassan II died, President Clinton, then U.S. President Clinton was there. Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, was there, and Hosni Mubarak, the Egyptian president, was there for the funeral of Hassan II, which underlies how Hassan II stressed this Arab identity of Morocco. If Hassan II stressed that Arab identity, his son Mohammed VI stresses more on the African identity of Morocco. Mohammed VI this year, in 2014, we're still in 2014, so in 2014 he spent almost 3 weeks in different African states. And he doesn't go for state visits and shake hands with the leaders, go to the and sign treaties in the ministries of foreign affairs. He stays in the countries, goes to the streets, shakes hands with people, goes to art galleries, mixes around with people. He spends time. Moroccan businessmen who have many interests in Africa go spend the day and fly back to Casablanca the same day. They don't even spend the night. And if they could take with them Sidi Ali and the tagine with them, they would do it. The king goes and spends 3 weeks in African states. And so he is stressing tremendously on this side of Morocco's identity and the role that Morocco can play in Africa. Morocco holds, in Moroccan universities, there are over 12,000 African students studying in Moroccan universities. After the crisis in Mali, 500 imams from Mali have been studying in Morocco, religious studies in Morocco. And then Côte d'Ivoire and Gabon and Senegal asked the king to train their own imams. And all of this is done with Moroccan scholarships and Moroccan funds, and these students go to study, follow religious studies in Morocco on Moroccan budget. So Morocco is playing, under Mohammed VI, is playing a lot on its African identity. As with the West, I think I don't have time to explore this a lot here, but it's very simple. Starting in 1962, we start seeing a clear tendency of Morocco to side with the West. There is a very important book. It's an outdated book, but it explains perfectly how Morocco, written by a Moroccan political scientist called Abdelhak Barramdan, Le Maroc et l'Occident. This book explains clearly how Morocco, how Hassan II anchored deeply Morocco with the West, how the very troubled relations that Morocco used to have with the West transited towards now having, in the Security Council on the Western Sahara issue, Morocco's main support are United States, France, and Spain. No one would have said that Spain would be one of the main supporters of Morocco in the Western Sahara issue a few years ago. Now Spain supports strongly, informally. This is not a stated policy, but strongly Morocco on the Western Sahara issue. As for Tunisia, Tunisia looks at the Arab world with some kind of very suspicious eyes. First of all, in the post-revolution Tunisia, the Gulf states have not looked at Tunisia's transition towards democracy with very positive eyes. They see that as a threat. Ben Ali is a refugee in Saudi Arabia. And the fact that Tunisia was, until very recently, governed by a Nahda that is seen by Gulf states as Muslim Brotherhood is seen as something threatening by the Gulf states. So the steady and clear progression of Tunisia towards stabilizing its democratic regime and the way Tunisia has managed to transit towards democracy after the revolution is not easily accepted by many Arab states and mainly by the Gulf regimes. And today by the Egypt of al-Sisi. So this is something that represents somehow of a threat to Tunisia. As for the West, the EU is somehow supportive of Tunisia's transition towards democracy, but the US is more enthusiastic about this transition towards democracy because the US does not hold the same suspicions towards Islamist parties that Western European states have. But Tunisia has a lot at stake in foreign policy. And I mention here two important issues that are migration and tourism. The tourism plays a key role in Tunisia's economy, and since the Arab Revolution and the fall of the regime of Ben Ali, tourism in Tunisia is in big crisis. So if Tunisia wants to turn definitely the page of the revolution and stabilize its democracy, it needs its economy to work better, to create jobs and to bring development to its people. And tourism is key, but tourism is very weak right now in Tunisia because of the felt instability. So one would hope that with the closing of the election cycles and the election of a new president very soon, Tunisia will start attracting tourists again and revamping its economy. But migration is also a major issue for Tunisia and a major sticking point in its relation with the European Union. So these are my closing remarks are exactly about this. How will Tunisia evolve after this very important revolution? What will be the consequences of the current election cycle? Will Nida Tunis strike a deal, a coalition government with Al-Nahda in Tunisia or not? Who will win the presidential elections? What will be the consequences of these things? No one knows clearly. It's very unclear. What are the impact of Bouteflika's imminent death? How long it will take? I mean, maybe I will die before Bouteflika, but I mean, Bouteflika's death is something that will have a major impact on Tunisia, on Algerian domestic and international politics. So, who will replace him, and what will be the orientation of the team that will have managed to establish the successor of Bouteflika? And in Morocco, it is striking how, despite a new constitution, the king is still the main foreign policy maker. The main policy maker in general, but the main player in Moroccan foreign policy. The new constitution gives the government many prerogatives, but no one seems to be interested in playing these prerogatives of the new constitution. I'm sorry it took me far longer than I was supposed to speak, but I'm open for questions now. Thank you very much.